I've had this uncomfortable feeling for a while. It seems to wax and wane, but is quite prevalent around November time. I don't usually give things like that much thought, but I finally realised what the cause is. Remembrance Day, Remembrance Sunday, Poppy Day, or whatever you want to call it. Wikipedia says it's a memorial day that has been observed in Commonwealth member states since the end of the First World War. Its purpose is to honour members of the armed forces who have died in the line of duty. The whole idea of Remembrance Day is that we are supposed to remember the sacrifices that these people made for us when fighting tyranny, so that we can live in peace, prosperity and freedom. Usually under this great system people call democracy. We are also supposed to remember the horrors of war so that we can ensure it never happens again. That's the usual narrative anyway, but it just doesn't seem quite right to me, and that's for a few reasons. The veterans didn't fight for us. They didn't sacrifice themselves for us. Democracy isn't as good as what people say it is. People claim to dislike violence, but actually they love it. And the most important lesson to take away is that Remembrance Sunday is an emotional tool used by the state to condition people into availing themselves to state violence. I will now elaborate on these points. Here we go. Firstly, the idea that the people who died were injured or suffered some other form of loss or harm in the wars and conflicts covered by Remembrance Day did so for us is just not correct. In interviews, veterans have quite clearly stated that they fought for themselves and the society, social systems, family, friends and life they had at the time. This is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But they also specifically stated that they did not fight for future people who didn't exist at the time of fighting. This seems obvious and intuitive to me. Would you fight or make sacrifices now for people who don't even exist, or who might exist in the future, most of whom you will never know, won't have much in common with, and probably won't like anyway? No, you won't. Will you fight or make sacrifices to protect yourself right now? That is more probable. The very fact that the people who benefited from these sacrifices by virtue of being born after the victory, like people who exist now, is just incidental. Credit can't be given to veterans, whether dead or alive, because of the fact that people who happened to be born after a given conflict enjoy a particular way of life. That is the existence they were born into and is all they know. That is their baseline. What I mean is, if a positive outcome results from a particular act, but that positive outcome wasn't in the minds of the people at the time of performing the act, the positive outcome doesn't warrant credit being awarded to the people who carried out the act. The positive outcome is just incidental and not necessarily intended or even thought of at the time. Think of mens rea and actus reus. Secondly, sacrifice is a term that is used quite a lot in this context, but I say it is a huge misnomer. In wars and conflicts gone by, many actions are said to have been self-sacrificial for the greater good. Examples of this include Japanese kamikaze pilots. However, in normal conflict, taking part doesn't amount to sacrifice, even if it is just measured quantitatively. By the way, when I say sacrifice, I mean being killed whilst serving a perceived greater purpose, not losing time or temporary loss of freedom of movement or property. In wars, most soldiers don't die, but for the ones that do, is it really a sacrifice? I don't think it is. It is well known that one of the biases in thinking that humans have is the idea that it won't happen to me. This somehow makes people think that they are invincible and can overcome terrible odds, and is usually the reason why people do stupid things and win a Darwin Award. Kamikaze pilots, Yeah, they knew they were going to die. They did sacrifice themselves. If soldiers take part in a battle against what could objectively appear to be overwhelmingly bad odds and are killed, this isn't a sacrifice. That's because they didn't think they were going to die, even in the face of the bad odds. This is due to the aforementioned bias in thinking that we as humans have. If you were going to engage in an activity with a high chance of death, would you do it? No. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. Generally, the only reason you might is if you thought you weren't going to die. But if you did die, you didn't plan on dying, you didn't want to die, and you didn't lie down and say kill me in an act of self-sacrifice. Therefore, it's not a sacrifice. Thirdly, is democracy good? I say no. That is a huge debate in itself, which I'll not go into in much detail at all here, for obvious reasons. There are different kinds of democracy, but it's allegedly the best system of governance humans have found up to now. Some people and some social groups, however big or small, are at different levels of development. Democracy might not be conducive to their current needs. Think Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It might even be a counterproductive distraction where other lower needs should do and do take primacy. Examples of this could be developing countries without the most basic of infrastructure. For the current democratic countries, also usually called WEIRD, an acronym for Western, Educated, Industrialised, Rich and Democratic, just look at what they are. Disparate, non-homogeneous groups of peoples loosely held together by laws and customs created by fascist megalomaniacs with people like Trudeau in charge. Is that the ideal? Sometimes I can see why a dictatorship might be preferable. Moving on. Fourthly, the implicit message from these kinds of memorial rituals, like Remembrance Sunday, is that violence is bad and let's not be violent. Is that some sort of attempt at humour? Let's see many of the places where violence lurks in society and popular culture. Quite a long list. Video games, books, films, TV programmes, comics, cartoons, sport, casual fights, domestic abuse, criminal assaults, abortion, corporal and capital punishment, animal abuse, the animal holocaust, state-sanctioned thugs like police and armed forces who use violence freely against people, animal experiments, martial arts, the arms industry worth an estimated $1,822 billion as of 2018. It might be a good idea to spend that money constructively instead of destructively. Many people use the idea that every cloud has a silver lining to try to justify violence and war by saying good things come from it. They usually reference medical and trauma care and various technological advances in weaponry that are applied elsewhere. How much more efficient would it be by allocating resources to these other purposes in the first place without developing weapons? A lot. However, violence is deeply embedded in our psychology and across cultures to the point where it is normalised and not questioned. It seems obvious to me that people like violence, whether they inflict it on someone or someone else does it on their behalf. Violence is everywhere. It's in your head, on your TV, in your culture, in the playground, and in your children's bedroom on the video games you buy for them. In the context of Remembrance Sunday though, it seems that violence is only okay if the state is allowed to use it, whether that be in war, punishment, or so-called law enforcement. The state also gets to decide who, when, and how violence is used. In other videos, I've talked about legality and morality being two different things. When a country legally declares war on another, Is that morally right? At the time of posting this video, Russia is at war with Ukraine, although Russia have called it a special military operation. Still war. People still dying. Is it legal? Well, they say it is, because the people who make the legal rules have also decided to wage war. Is it moral? I saw a picture a few days ago of a toddler with Russian shrapnel in his head. He died, of course. Are the levels of anticipated and apparently acceptable collateral damage morally right? What about the effect on the environment, animals, and innocent people for years to come? People talk about protecting women and children and civilians. Is it okay then to blast the shit out of men or combatants? Do they not matter? Is it okay to cause unspeakable injuries and suffering? I'll answer that one. No, it isn't. Men feel pain physically and psychologically too. War and violence, although affecting everyone, amounts to systematic sexism against men and boys. The fact that the state gets to decide who uses violence and when and how, and that the state officiates the majority of memorial rituals in places that have them, leads me on to my next point. Number 5. Remembrance Day and memorial rituals of this sort are actually celebrations of violence. They are organised by the state to influence people into behaving in ways of benefit to the state. They are emotional tools expertly deployed to control people. Magic is said to be the ability to make people think something is possible that normally isn't. To do this, you have to influence people and control their minds. Emotional and rational thinking almost seems dichotomous. Most people aren't rational, so therefore think emotionally. The state knows this. It uses magic in the form of rituals, ceremonies, music, lights, marching, uniforms, symbolism, tradition, imagery, hierarchical structures with rank insignias, speeches usually given by powerful orators, remember Hitler, superstition, religion, social pressure, think of white feathers, medals and other bravery awards, titles, 2-minute silence, gunfire, and the creating of the dominant narrative around war and Remembrance Day. All these things are used to influence people and evoke emotions to make people think that violence is honourable and acceptable in the service of statism. This is done hypocritically though, as only violence on behalf of the state is considered acceptable. I happen to be very attuned to this way of influencing people. Here's an example. The only time I've been in a Catholic church, they are very good at this by the way, the only time I've been in a church was for a funeral. The amount of magic used there was huge. It was a very powerful and moving time, even for me. But I could see it for what it was. It still evoked a lot of emotions, and emotions, if genuine, are spontaneous. We can't control them. We can only decide how we are going to act if we are emotionally intelligent. The power that the state and religion has in controlling people lies in the fact that the methods they use appeal to aspects of people's personalities that are already there. In this case, it's usually the primitive patriotism that people without general ideas have. Evolutionary explanations of superstitious thinking in humans are well established. To think that way is wrong though. It is an evolutionary relic that has served its purpose but is no longer relevant. An informative book that discusses how the state can use magic to influence people is The Nazis and the Occult by Paul Rowland. Link below. Examples of the ridiculous behaviours seen on display in recent years at the time of Remembrance Day are the crass and unoriginal so-called artworks of poppies in ever-expanding and elaborate ways. Does this benefit veterans? Or does it just give exposure to whoever created them? Whatever happened to elegant simplicity? The idea of Remembrance Sunday is yet another concept that seems off limits to critical discussion. That is one of the reasons I decided to make this video. Despite having said all that, I don't want to sound like I'm making an attack on veterans. They endured terrible things on all sides and so-called countries. Maybe they thought they were doing right. It seems to me that years ago, with less access to information for ordinary people, in a more controlled and stratified society where you must know your place, where people were less worldly and had more of a collectivist nature, that many people didn't have the choice or the ability to do anything different than fight. However, this is now. We, the people, have access to information and communication. We can organise globally as people, not as nations or tribes or races or religions, not the violent one anyway, and not be influenced and controlled by the state to mindlessly kill and be killed, just to maintain statism. Statism is their dominance hierarchy that they will do anything to keep, because they are at the top. Anything includes sending millions of people to their deaths, as they've done before and they wouldn't think twice about doing again. These people include you, your friends and all your family, whether fighting or not. There is a saying that funerals are for the living. When your granny dies, who benefits from the funeral? Apart from the funeral director, I mean. Your granny doesn't benefit. She's dead. You benefit. On Remembrance Sunday, a funeral for veterans, who benefits? Not the veterans, they're dead. The state benefits in controlling your mind to perform violence on their behalf. So, is it a remembrance parade or a remembrance charade? The next time you're silent for 2 minutes, think about that.